It wasn't the kind of thing I ever thought I'd get caught doing, sitting alone at night, exploring websites filled with stories and videos I had no business watching. But when I turned around and saw him, Eli, my stepson, standing there with my laptop open, staring at the screen, my heart stopped. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, everything changed. It started on an evening like any other. The house was quiet, too quiet. Robert was out of town for a business convention, leaving me alone in the house with Eli. I had grown used to these stretches of time when my husband was away. Our marriage had fallen into a predictable rhythm, one where his absence had become more comfortable than his presence. That night, I had poured myself a second glass of wine after dinner. Maybe a third. I wasn't counting. I was tired, not from work, editing manuscripts for the same dull romance novels day after day, but from the weight of it all. Life. Loneliness. For a woman in her mid-50s, I'd accepted certain truths about myself. I had become invisible, and not just to my husband, to the world. Women like me were rarely seen, rarely desired. I was someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's stepmother. No one ever looked at me anymore. The wine buzzed through me, warm and heavy as I sat in bed with my laptop. It started innocently enough. A random ad, a click out of curiosity. That curiosity led to a rabbit hole I hadn't expected. Videos, stories, entire websites catering to people like me. People who secretly wanted something they couldn't say aloud. Older women. Younger men. I don't know how long I spent scrolling through those stories, those headlines that made my cheeks flush and my breath catch. I told myself I was just reading, just looking, that it was harmless. No one would ever know. But then I heard it, the creak of the bedroom door behind me. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. At first, I thought I had imagined it, that it was just the house settling, the kind of sound I'd long since gotten used to when Robert was away. But then I felt it. A presence. Someone standing behind me. Slowly, I turned my head, the blood draining from my face as I met Eli's eyes. He was standing in the doorway, barefoot and silent, his gaze locked on the laptop screen. The light from the screen cast a faint glow on his face, highlighting the shock, or was it something else, in his expression. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Eli looked at me, then back at the screen. I knew what he was seeing, the website's bright, shameful header, the words I hadn't even had time to close out. I wanted to explain, to say something, but no words came, and then, as if the silence wasn't unbearable enough, he stepped closer. I felt a hot flush crawl up my neck as I slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. I expected him to say something. A question, a joke, an accusation, anything. But he didn't. Eli's face was unreadable as he stood there, staring at me. Not with judgment, not with anger. It was something else entirely, something that made my chest feel tight, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Good night, Clara." His voice was calm, too calm, as he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence. The door clicked shut behind him. I stayed frozen for a long time, my hands trembling as I stared at the closed laptop. My mind raced, replaying the moment over and over again until I couldn't tell what had been real and what I'd imagined. What had he seen? How much had he understood? Eli hadn't laughed. He hadn't teased me. That would have been easier to handle, something I could dismiss as a moment of humiliation that we'd both pretend never happened. But the way he looked at me, I couldn't get it out of my head. It wasn't pity, it wasn't disgust, it was something else. Something I didn't want to name. I sank back against the pillows, my pulse pounding in my ears. My cheeks were still burning, my chest still tight. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. Eli was probably already back in his room, shaking his head and laughing about what a sad, lonely woman I had become. But I didn't believe that. Because I had seen the way his expression changed when he looked at me. Slowly, subtly, like he was seeing me for the first time. I sat there in the darkness for hours, the laptop sitting on the nightstand beside me like a loaded weapon. I didn't dare open it again. I didn't dare move. When I finally closed my eyes, I could still see him standing there. Silent, watching, and the worst part, the part that terrified me more than anything, was the heat I felt rising in my chest every time I thought about it. I couldn't stop replaying that moment, Couldn't stop wondering what he was thinking as he stood there, looking at me like that. Like I was a woman. The next morning, the weight of what had happened the night before sat heavy on my chest. I barely slept. I kept replaying Eli's face in my mind, his calm, unreadable expression, and the way he turned and walked out without a word. I told myself it was nothing. I'd overreacted, fueled by too much wine and too little sleep. He probably thought it was funny, a moment of harmless embarrassment that we'd both forget. And yet, as I stood in the kitchen pouring myself a cup of coffee, my hands trembled. I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. The sound sent a jolt through me, and I gripped the edge of the counter. A second later, Eli walked into the kitchen. I didn't dare look up. I focused on the coffee, as if it held the answers to every question circling in my mind. I could feel him there, his presence filling the room like an invisible weight. I waited for him to say something, to laugh, to tease me, to let me know that he hadn't taken last night seriously. But he didn't. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned casually against the counter across from me. I could feel his eyes on me, watching me in a way that made my skin prickle. It was different now. He was different. Or maybe I was. I forced myself to take a deep breath, finally lifting my gaze to meet his. "Morning," I said, my voice tight. He nodded, taking a sip of water. "Morning." His tone was neutral, but his eyes lingered on me a little longer than they should have, like he was waiting for me to say something more. I didn't. I turned away quickly, pretending to tidy up the counter, even though it was already spotless. The silence stretched on, heavy and unspoken, until Eli finally pushed off the counter and walked out of the room. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my heart hammering in my chest. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. I threw myself into work, editing chapters of a dull historical romance novel that would have normally put me to sleep. But even as I stared at the words on the screen, I couldn't focus. All I could think about was Eli. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing in the doorway, looking at me like that. My cheeks burned with shame just thinking about it, but there was something else, too. Something I wasn't ready to admit to myself. The way he looked at me hadn't been judgmental. It hadn't been disgusted. It had been curious. The thought sent a shiver through me, and I pushed it away as quickly as it came. I couldn't think like that. I wouldn't. By the time the sun began to set, I couldn't sit at my desk any longer. I needed to get out of the house. I grabbed my coat and keys, deciding to take a walk through the neighborhood, hoping the cold evening air would clear my head. But when I opened the front door, Eli was there on the porch, sitting on the top step with his phone in his hands. He looked up at me, startled, and I froze. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his tone casual. "I just needed some air," I replied, clutching my coat tighter around me. He nodded, standing up and stretching his arms over his head. "Mind if I join you?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to say no, to tell him I needed to be alone, but the words wouldn't come. "Sure," I said finally. We walked in silence, side by side, down the quiet, tree-lined street. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. I shoved my hands into my coat pockets, my heart pounding as I tried to ignore the tension that hummed between us. I kept waiting for Eli to say something about last night, for him to bring it up, to laugh it off. But he didn't. Instead, he walked beside me quietly, his hands in his pockets, his face calm and unreadable. The silence was unbearable. "I didn't hear you come in last night," I said suddenly, my voice too loud in the still evening air. "Were you out late?" He glanced at me, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Not too late." I nodded quickly, focusing on the sound of our footsteps on the pavement. I didn't know why I asked. I didn't care where he'd been. Or at least, I shouldn't. We reached the park at the end of the street, and Eli stopped, turning to face me. The faint glow of the streetlight illuminated his face, casting shadows that made him look older, sharper. "Are you okay?" he asked. The question caught me off guard, and I blinked up at him, startled. "What?" "You seemed distracted," he said, studying me carefully. I felt my cheeks flush, and I looked away quickly. "I'm fine." "You're lying," he said softly. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The tension between us was thick, the silence filled with something unspoken, something I didn't want to name. Finally, Eli took a step closer, his voice low. "You don't have to be embarrassed, you know." I looked up at him sharply, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. We both knew what he was talking about. I wanted to say something, to tell him he was wrong, that there was nothing to be embarrassed about. But I couldn't. My voice failed me, and all I could do was stare up at him, frozen in place. Eli didn't move. He just looked at me, his gaze steady and unflinching, as if he could see right through me. My chest felt tight, my pulse racing as the silence stretched on, growing heavier with every passing second. Finally, he turned away, his voice calm. "We should head back. It's getting late." I nodded quickly, my hands trembling as I followed him back toward the house. My mind was spinning, my thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and shame and something else, something I couldn't admit to myself. When we got home, Eli disappeared upstairs without another word, leaving me alone in the living room, staring at the empty space where he'd been standing. I sank onto the couch, my heart still racing as I pressed my hands to my face. What was happening to me? That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the house settled around me. I could hear Eli moving around in his room across the hall, and each faint creak of the floorboards sent a jolt through me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, reading too much into a moment that didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had shifted between us, and I didn't know how to stop it. The days that followed were a blur of silence and tension. I kept my head down, hiding in work and household chores, anything to avoid being alone with Eli for too long. It wasn't that he said or did anything wrong. No, it was far worse than that. He didn't say anything at all. There were no teasing remarks, no awkward jokes about what he'd seen on my laptop, just a quiet, lingering presence that seemed to grow heavier every time we shared the same space. It was as though the moment had created something between us, something unspoken, something dangerous. I tried to pretend I was imagining it, that I was just paranoid. But I wasn't. I could feel it, that invisible string that pulled at me every time he was near. One evening, Robert called to tell me he'd be staying another day in Boston. He was supposed to be home by morning, but the client needed more face time, as he always said. I don't remember what I mumbled in response. The words were a formality. He didn't care what I thought, and I didn't care where he was. After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into the couch in the living room. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I tried to lose myself in the book I was holding, but I couldn't focus. The words blurred together, my mind spinning in circles as I tried to push away the feeling that had been following me for days. And then Eli walked in. I didn't hear him at first. I only noticed him when I felt him there, standing in the doorway, watching me. I looked up sharply, my heart giving a nervous flutter as his eyes met mine. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice wavered slightly. He shook his head, walking into the room and sitting down on the other end of the couch. The silence stretched on as he leaned back against the cushions, his long legs stretched out in front of him. I kept my eyes on the book in my lap, pretending to read, but I could feel him watching me. "What are you reading?" he asked finally. "Nothing interesting," I murmured. "Then why are you pretending to read it?" The question startled me. I looked up at him, my breath catching when I saw the faint smile on his lips, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest and I couldn't understand why. "You've been avoiding me," Eli said quietly. The words sent a chill through me, even though his tone was calm. He was right, of course. I had been avoiding him, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel real, like an accusation I couldn't deny. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied quickly, forcing my eyes back down to the book. Eli didn't respond. I could feel his gaze lingering on me, but I refused to look up. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the page, pretending I couldn't feel the heat rising in my cheeks. And then, I felt it. The couch shifted slightly as Eli moved closer. I froze, my fingers tightening around the book as my breath hitched. I could feel him beside me now, close enough that the warmth of his body brushed against my arm. "Clara," he murmured. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. I wanted to tell him to stop, to stand up, to go back to his room, to leave me alone. But the words wouldn't come. Slowly I turned my head to look at him. He was close, too close. His eyes searched mine, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us crackling like static. I should have moved. I should have said something. But I didn't. I couldn't. Eli's hand lifted slowly, his fingers brushing against my cheek. The touch was light, hesitant, as if he were testing the waters, waiting to see if I would pull away. I didn't. My breath caught as his thumb traced the line of my jaw, so soft it sent a shiver through me. I felt frozen in place, paralyzed by the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Fear, guilt, desire. "This can't happen," I whispered, though my voice trembled. "Then tell me to stop," he murmured. I opened my mouth to say the words, but they wouldn't come. I couldn't say them. I couldn't want to say them, because the truth was I didn't want him to stop. Eli leaned closer, his lips brushing against mine in the faintest of kisses, a question, not an answer. I felt my body respond before my mind could catch up, my fingers trembling as they curled into the fabric of his shirt. And then I kissed him back. It was like something inside me snapped. The kiss deepened, and all the guilt, all the shame, all the rules I'd been clinging to melted away in an instant. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as my body pressed against his. I felt weightless, dizzy, as if the world had shifted beneath me and left us floating in some place that only we could exist. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my heart hammering in my chest as I stared at him. "This is wrong," I whispered, the words barely audible. "Then why does it feel right?" He replied softly. I didn't have an answer. I didn't have the strength to argue. Instead, I stood up quickly, putting distance between us as I tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking as I ran them through my hair, my mind spinning. "I can't," I said finally, though my voice was weak. "This can't happen." Eli didn't argue. He didn't try to stop me. He just looked at me, his expression calm, as though he already knew the decision I'd made wasn't final. And maybe he was right. I went to bed that night with the ghost of his touch still lingering on my skin. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling as my mind replayed everything. The way he'd looked at me, the way his hands had felt on my waist, the way I had let it happen. I hated myself for it, but the worst part was that I couldn't stop thinking about it, about him, about what it would feel like if I let it happen again. It's strange how easily a line can be crossed. One moment you're standing at the edge, convincing yourself you'd never take that final step, and the next you're tumbling forward, powerless to stop it. That's how it felt with Eli. After that night in the living room, when his lips brushed mine and I didn't pull away, everything shifted. The unspoken tension that had been simmering between us for days finally boiled over. There was no denying it anymore. We had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. At first I told myself it wouldn't happen again. I avoided him, retreating to my bedroom like a guilty teenager and throwing myself into my work. I filled my days with endless editing projects and kept myself busy with mindless tasks around the house, anything to keep from being alone with him. But it didn't matter. Avoidance wasn't enough. Eli was always there. I'd hear him moving around in the kitchen, the faint clink of dishes as he made himself coffee. I'd see him outside through the window, his shirt off as he worked on the lawn, sweat glistening on his skin. I'd pass him in the hallway, my body brushing his as we squeezed by each other in the narrow space. And every time our eyes met, I felt it. Something electric, something unspoken that tied us together. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I finally broke. The rain had been coming down in sheets all day, the kind of relentless downpour that makes the world feel smaller, quieter. I had just finished a call with a particularly demanding client, and my nerves were frayed. I was tired, restless, and completely on edge. I walked into the kitchen to make tea, hoping it would calm me, but the moment I turned the corner, I saw him. Eli was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone, his long fingers tapping against the screen. He looked up when I entered, his eyes locking onto mine. Something in me shifted. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the kettle as I filled it with water and set it on the stove. I could feel him watching me, his gaze steady and heavy, but I refused to look at him. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the soft patter of rain against the windows. I stood there, staring at the kettle, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. My heart was pounding, my skin tingling with a nervous energy I couldn't explain. Finally, I felt him move. The chair scraped softly against the floor as he stood up. I didn't turn around, but I knew he was walking toward me. The room felt smaller, hotter. I closed my eyes, my breath catching in my throat as I felt him stop behind me. He didn't touch me. Not yet, but his presence was so close I could feel the heat radiating off him. "Clara," he said softly. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It was just my name. But the way he said it, low and deliberate, made my entire body tense. I should have turned around and told him to stop. I should have pushed him away, reminded him that this was wrong. But I didn't. I stayed frozen, my hands trembling against the counter. The kettle began to hum softly as it heated up, but I barely heard it. Then I felt it. His hand touched my waist, lightly at first, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. When I didn't, his grip tightened, his fingers curling into the fabric of my shirt. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. Slowly, I turned to face him. Eli's face was close, too close. His eyes searched mine, looking for something I wasn't ready to name. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as he lifted his other hand, his thumb brushing gently against my cheek. For a moment I thought he would say something, that he would give me one last chance to stop this. But he didn't. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, and the dam finally broke. I kissed him back. It was different this time. Deeper, more desperate, as though we'd both been holding back for too long. His hands moved to my hips, pulling me closer until my body pressed against his. I felt weightless, dizzy, as his mouth moved over mine, his touch igniting something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. The kettle began to whistle, a sharp, high-pitched sound that filled the room. But neither of us moved. Finally, I pulled back, breathless, my chest heaving as I stared up at him. His hands were still on my waist, his fingers warm and firm against my skin. I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Eli didn't say anything either. He just looked at me, his expression calm and steady, as though he'd known this would happen all along. For a moment, the only sound was the whistling of the kettle, still shrieking on the stove. Then Eli let go of me, stepping back slowly. "You should take care of that," he murmured, nodding toward the stove. I blinked, startled, as though I'd forgotten where I was. I turned quickly, my hands trembling as I shut off the burner and moved the kettle to the side. When I turned back around, Eli was gone. I spent the rest of the day in a fog. I couldn't focus on work. I couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying the moment in my head, his hands on my waist, his lips on mine, the way I hadn't stopped him. I told myself it was a mistake, that it couldn't happen again. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. That kiss had set something in motion, something I couldn't take back. I spent hours pacing the house, jumping at every sound, waiting for Eli to come back. But he didn't. His door stayed shut, and the house felt emptier than it ever had. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I could still feel him. His touch, his warmth, the way his lips felt against mine. I wanted to stop thinking about him. I wanted to feel guilty, to remind myself that this was wrong. But I didn't. I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't want to stop. And that terrified me more than anything. It would be easy to say I didn't know how it happened, that I was swept up in something I couldn't control. But that would be a lie. The truth is, I let it happen, again and again. Each time I told myself it was the last, but I never meant it. The line that we had crossed didn't matter anymore because I'd stopped looking for it. Once I tasted what Eli offered, attention, desire, the feeling of being seen, I couldn't let it go, and he didn't let me. The days blurred together after the kiss in the kitchen. I avoided him at first, or at least I pretended to. But it was all for show. I knew it. Eli knew it. The tension between us was like a constant hum, growing louder every time we were in the same room. He didn't push me. He didn't say a word about what had happened. Instead, he let the silence speak for him. His eyes lingering on mine a little too long, his hand brushing against my back as he walked by, his presence filling whatever space I was in. I had been starved for so long that even the smallest touch felt electric. It was a Saturday afternoon when I broke again. Robert had been gone for days, wrapped up in meetings and work trips that I stopped asking about years ago. I was in the sunroom, flipping aimlessly through a book, though I wasn't reading a single word. The house was quiet, but I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel Eli's presence somewhere nearby. It had become a habit now, this strange awareness of him, the way my pulse quickened when I knew he was close. When I glanced up, he was there. Eli stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, watching me with that same unreadable expression that made my stomach twist. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I set the book down, my hands trembling slightly as I looked at him. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us louder than anything either of us could have said. Then he stepped forward. I should have stopped him. I should have told him to leave, to go back to his room, to let me pretend this wasn't happening. But I didn't. I couldn't. It started slowly at first, his hands brushing my shoulders as he stood behind me, his fingers warm and steady as they lingered longer than they should have. My breath caught as his touch moved lower, grazing my arms, pulling me to my feet until I was facing him. The air between us felt heavy, charged, like a storm waiting to break. My chest was tight, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I met his eyes, dark, certain, unflinching, and I felt something in me give way. When his lips met mine, I didn't hesitate. The kiss was hungry, desperate, filled with all the things we hadn't said, all the tension we'd been pretending didn't exist. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer until my body was pressed against his. I felt his strength, the heat radiating off him, and for the first time in years I let myself stop thinking. It didn't matter where we were or what we were doing. It didn't matter how wrong it was. All that mattered was the way his hands moved over me, the way he kissed me like he couldn't get enough, like I was something he wanted. I didn't feel invisible anymore. It wasn't just that one time. Once the dam had broken, we couldn't stop ourselves. Eli sought me out constantly, quiet moments when Robert was out of the house, late nights when the world felt still, afternoons when sunlight poured through the windows and made the whole house feel golden and surreal. We were reckless. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the guest bedroom, I heard the door click softly behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. I felt it, that familiar pull that made my pulse race. Eli didn't say anything as he crossed the room. I felt his hands on my waist before I even turned to face him, pulling me back against him. My breath hitched as his lips brushed my neck, my hands trembling as the clean, folded laundry fell to the floor. Later, as I lay beside him in the tangled sheets of the guest bed, I stared up at the ceiling, my chest rising and falling as I tried to steady my breathing. Eli's arm was draped lazily across my stomach, his fingers tracing soft, aimless circles on my skin. I knew I should feel guilty. I knew I should stop, but I didn't. We stole moments wherever we could, quiet encounters that left me breathless and shaken, hidden in plain sight. Once, in the early hours of the morning, I slipped downstairs to make coffee while Robert was still asleep. I was standing at the counter, waiting for the kettle to boil, when Eli came up behind me. He didn't say anything. He just placed a hand on the small of my back, his touch light but deliberate, his fingers grazing the curve of my waist. I froze, my breath catching as I stared down at the countertop, my hands trembling against the cool marble. "Eli," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His touch lingered for just a moment longer before he walked away, leaving me there with my heart racing and my cheeks burning. We were playing a dangerous game, and we both knew it. I started noticing the change in him, too. Eli wasn't the boy I had watched grow up. He was a man now, confident, strong, and deliberate in a way that made my stomach twist with equal parts excitement and fear. There was a possessiveness in the way he looked at me now, a quiet certainty that sent shivers down my spine. It scared me sometimes, the intensity of it, but it thrilled me too. When we were alone, he made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. And I let him. One evening, as the sun was setting and the house was bathed in gold and shadows, I stood at the sink washing dishes. Robert was away, another important meeting that didn't concern me. I didn't hear Eli approach until he was right behind me. His hands slid around my waist, pulling me back against him. I felt the heat of his breath on my neck, his lips grazing my skin as my heart began to race. "You shouldn't," I whispered, even though I didn't move. His grip on me tightened, his voice low in my ear. "Do you want me to stop?" I closed my eyes, my body betraying me as I leaned into him, my hands gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. "No," I whispered, and just like that, I let myself fall again. It wasn't a question of right or wrong anymore. It was a question of when everything would come crashing down. Because deep down, I knew it couldn't last. We were reckless, careless, and sooner or later, someone would notice. And when they did, the fallout would destroy everything. Things that are forbidden always burn the brightest. Maybe that's why I ignored every warning sign, every whisper in my head telling me this couldn't last. In those weeks, Eli and I moved like ghosts through the house, two people pretending life hadn't completely changed. We stole hours, stolen kisses behind closed doors, stolen touches in the dark. I convinced myself it was just for us, that as long as we were careful, no one would know. But I underestimated just how fragile secrets are. It started with something small. A forgotten shirt. It was early one morning, and I was tidying up the guest room where Eli had slept the night before. Robert had left at dawn for another early meeting, and I knew Eli wouldn't wake for at least another hour. The sheets were rumpled, still warm from where we'd tangled ourselves in them just a few hours earlier. I folded them carefully, smoothing out the creases. That's when I saw it, a black t-shirt thrown over the back of the chair. It was Eli's. The sight of it made my breath catch. I grabbed it quickly, my hands trembling as I stuffed it into the laundry hamper. But the fear had already taken root. Robert hadn't stepped foot in this room in months. He never had a reason to. But I knew it only took one moment of carelessness for everything to fall apart. And we were being careless. The second crack appeared 2 days later. I was at the gallery, struggling to concentrate on a manuscript I was reviewing, when my phone buzzed. I reached for it absent-mindedly, assuming it was Robert checking in. But it wasn't. It was a message. An anonymous number. "I know what you're doing." My heart stopped. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as my hands shook. I read it again, hoping it was a mistake, a prank. But I knew better. The phone slipped from my hands, clattering onto the desk. My pulse raced as panic began to set in. Who was it? Someone from the neighborhood? A friend? Could Robert know? I forced myself to breathe, to think. It was probably nothing, a coincidence, a cruel old joke from someone who didn't even know me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone had seen us. When I got home that evening, the house felt different. Like a shadow had crept into every corner. Eli was sitting in the living room, watching something on TV, but when I walked in, he looked up. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I set my keys on the counter and disappeared upstairs, shutting the bedroom door behind me as I tried to steady myself. The message rattled inside my head like a ticking clock. Someone knew. Someone had to know. It wasn't just the message either. I started noticing things, subtle, tiny things that most people wouldn't even think twice about. A curtain moved when I walked into a room. A car parked down the street that didn't belong to any of the neighbors. A friend's lingering glance during an otherwise innocent conversation. Paranoia took hold of me, tightening its grip with every passing day. It wasn't long before the third crack appeared. This time, it wasn't subtle. Robert came home earlier than expected one Friday evening. I hadn't seen the headlights in the driveway, hadn't heard the door open. I was in the kitchen with Eli, standing too close to him, my hand brushing against his arm as we talked. And then I heard it. The clearing of a throat. I froze. Eli stepped back quickly, his face shifting to a neutral mask, but it was too late. I turned to see Robert standing in the doorway, his briefcase still in hand, his eyes moving between the two of us. For a moment, no one said anything. The silence stretched on, suffocating. "Didn't expect you home so soon," I said, forcing my voice to sound normal. Robert's gaze lingered on me for a moment too long, before he finally set the briefcase down and muttered something about traffic. He didn't look at Eli again. Dinner that night was unbearable. Robert barely spoke, his eyes occasionally flicking toward me or Eli, as if trying to piece something together. I told myself it was just my imagination, that he didn't know anything. But I could feel it. the tension crackling in the air like static electricity. We weren't being careful anymore, and someone was going to catch us. It happened a week later. The house was quiet that night. Robert was in his office, working late as usual, and Eli was in the garage fixing something on his car. I was in the living room, pacing, my nerves on edge as I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. And then I heard it. The slam of the front door. Robert's voice. "Clara!" I froze, my heart stopping as the sound of his footsteps echoed through the house. When he appeared in the doorway, his face was red, his eyes wild with anger. He was holding something in his hand, a manila envelope. "Who is it?" he demanded, throwing the envelope onto the coffee table. "What?" My voice was barely a whisper. "Don't play games with me, Clara. Who is it?" I stared at the envelope, my hands shaking as I reached for it. Inside were photos. Grainy, black and white images of me and Eli, on the couch, in the guest room, in the kitchen. Proof. "I found this in the mailbox today," Robert said, his voice low and trembling. "Who sent it? How long has this been going on?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The room was spinning, and all I could do was stare at the photos, the life I'd tried so desperately to keep hidden, now laid bare. Then Eli appeared in the doorway. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm but guarded. Robert turned to look at him, his expression darkening as understanding clicked into place. "You," he spat. "It's you, isn't it?" Eli didn't deny it. He didn't say anything. Robert turned back to me, his face twisted with disgust. "You've been sleeping with him? My son?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing I could say to fix this. Nothing I could say to make him understand. "You disgust me," Robert said quietly. The words hit harder than I expected. I wanted to shout, to tell him it wasn't that simple, that Eli had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. But the truth wouldn't matter to him. He turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Eli spoke. "It doesn't matter what he thinks." I looked at him, my chest tight, tears streaming down my face. "It's over, Eli." He stepped forward, his voice soft but certain. "It doesn't have to be." But I knew it did. In the weeks that followed, everything fell apart. Robert filed for divorce. He moved out of the house, leaving it feeling emptier than ever. People talked. Whispers followed me everywhere I went. I avoided the neighbors, avoided the gallery, avoided everything. Eli stayed for a while, but it wasn't the same. The fire that had burned so brightly between us had turned to ash, tainted by everything we had destroyed. One day, I came home to find his bags packed. "Where will you go?" I asked softly. He shrugged. "Somewhere else." I watched him walk out the door, feeling the finality of it settle like a stone in my chest. Now, as I sit here alone in this quiet house, I can't say I regret what happened. I should, but I don't. Eli made me feel something I didn't think I could feel anymore. Wanted, alive, seen. But the cost was everything. And some nights, when the house is silent, I wonder if it was worth it. I told myself it was nothing. Just a glance. A fleeting, accidental meeting of eyes in a quiet house. But when I walked past him that morning, wearing something I shouldn't have, his gaze followed me, slow and deliberate. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper, something I felt in the air between us, like an unspoken challenge. And for the first time in years, I didn't know if I wanted to step back or step closer. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of quiet day I used to enjoy. The house was still. The faint sound of birds outside the only noise, and I was savoring the rare stillness. Ethan had been staying with me for a few weeks now, filling the space James had left behind in ways I hadn't expected. I'd thought it would be temporary, just until he figured out his next steps after finishing grad school. But even in such a short time, his presence had changed the house, brought life back into it. And, I hated to admit, brought something else back into me. That morning, I hadn't thought much about what I was wearing. A silk robe, one James had bought me years ago, the kind that clung to the skin in soft waves. It wasn't revealing, not exactly, but it was more intimate than anything I usually wore around the house. I wasn't expecting to see Ethan at that hour, assuming he'd still be asleep. But as I walked out of my room, cup of tea in hand, there he was, standing at the end of the hallway. He was leaning against the wall, barefoot, a mug in one hand. The faint smile on his lips froze the moment I stepped into view. his gaze drifted over me, lingering just a second too long before meeting mine. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes gave him away. "Good morning," I replied quickly, clutching the tea like a lifeline and moving past him. I could feel his gaze follow me, heat rising in my cheeks as I escaped into the kitchen. My heart was pounding in a way I couldn't explain, my body hyper-aware of the encounter. It was nothing, I told myself again. Just a look. But that look stayed with me all day. Ethan had always been polite, reserved even. He was nothing like James, who was brash and charming and knew how to command a room. Ethan was quieter, more thoughtful, the kind of person who listened before he spoke. It had taken years for him to warm up to me when James and I first married. By the time he left for college, we'd settled into a comfortable, if distant, understanding of each other. But the man who returned to my house after James's death wasn't the same boy who'd left. Ethan had grown into himself. He was confident now, more self-assured. And there was something about him that unsettled me in a way I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just his looks, though I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed. His broad shoulders, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled. It was all impossible to ignore. But it was more than that. It was the way he filled the house, his presence quiet but undeniable. The way he made me feel seen, in a way I hadn't felt in years. And now, with that lingering look from the hallway replaying in my mind, I felt like something had shifted. I tried to shake it off as the day went on, throwing myself into tasks I didn't really need to do. I cleaned the kitchen twice, reorganized the pantry, even spent an hour in the garden pulling weeds. But no matter how hard I worked, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. That evening, we sat down for dinner together. Something we'd fallen into the habit of doing since he'd moved in. The conversation was light, easy, but I couldn't help noticing the way his eyes lingered on me when I spoke. "You've been busy today," he said, his tone casual as he leaned back in his chair. I shrugged, keeping my gaze fixed on my plate. "Just trying to stay productive." His lips quirked into a small smile. "You don't always have to keep yourself busy, you know?" The comment caught me off guard. I looked up, meeting his gaze across the table. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," he said quickly, but his expression softened. "It's just, you deserve to take a break sometimes." The way he said it, so sincere and gentle, left me momentarily speechless. I forced a smile, changing the subject quickly, but his words lingered long after dinner was over. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Ethan had looked at me in the hallway that morning. The intensity of his gaze, the way it had made me feel both vulnerable and alive at the same time. It was a feeling I hadn't expected. One I wasn't sure I wanted. But it was there, undeniable, and no amount of reasoning could make it go away. The days that followed were a careful dance, though I wasn't sure who was leading. I told myself to keep my distance, to maintain the boundaries that had always been there. But Ethan's presence was magnetic, and no matter how hard I tried, I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain or justify. It started with the little things. He began joining me in the garden, offering to help pull weeds or trim back the hedges that had grown wild since James passed. At first, I thought it was just politeness, a way for him to pass the time. But then there were the moments that lingered, the ones that felt like they meant something more. One afternoon, I was kneeling in the dirt, tugging at a stubborn weed, when Ethan crouched beside me. His hands were rougher than I expected as they brushed against mine, taking hold of the same root. "Here," he said softly. "Let me." I let go, watching as his strong hands worked the weed free from the soil. When he looked up at me, there was a faint smile on his lips, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. "You make it look easy," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "It's all about the angle," he replied, his smile widening. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the sunlight casting golden highlights in his hair. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. "Thanks," I murmured, turning back to the garden. But I could feel his gaze on me, and it made my hands tremble. That evening, after dinner, we sat together in the living room. The storm outside had settled into a steady rain, the sound of it tapping against the windows. Ethan was stretched out on the couch, flipping idly through a book, while I sat in the armchair with a cup of tea. "I don't know how you stay so calm," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I looked up, surprised. What do you mean? He closed the book, his gaze meeting mine. This house, it's so quiet. Doesn't it ever get overwhelming? I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the mug. Sometimes, I admitted, but I'm used to it. Ethan nodded, leaning forward slightly. I don't think I could do it. I need noise, movement, something to keep my mind busy. I smiled faintly. That's why you're always fixing things, isn't it? He chuckled. Maybe. There was a pause, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken words. I didn't mean to bring it up, he said finally, his tone softer. I don't know. I feel like you deserve more than this. The sincerity in his voice took me off guard. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. More than what? This, he said, gesturing vaguely around the room. This quiet, this loneliness. You deserve to feel alive. The word hit me like a jolt, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I'm fine, Ethan, I said quickly, setting the mug down and standing. You don't need to worry about me. But as I walked past him, I could feel his eyes on me, steady and unflinching. The next day, I found Ethan in the garage, sorting through a pile of old tools that had belonged to James. He looked up when I stepped inside, his expression softening. Need something? He asked, wiping his hands on a rag. No, I said, hesitating in the doorway. I just wanted to see what you were up to. He smiled, setting down the wrench he was holding. Just trying to make sense of all this. Your husband kept everything. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the shelves lined with jars of nails and screws, half-empty cans of paint, and tools that hadn't been touched in years. He always said you never know when you might need something, I said softly. Ethan laughed. Sounds like him. For a moment we stood in silence, the weight of James's absence settling over us. Then Ethan turned to me, his gaze steady. Do you miss him? The question caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. Every day, I admitted. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. I do too. I looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. You don't talk about him much, he shrugged, his eyes dropping to the floor. It's hard. He wasn't around a lot when I was growing up, but he tried in his own way. He loved you, I said quietly. Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting mine. I know, he said, and I think he'd want you to be happy. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. That evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, I felt Ethan's presence before I heard him. He stepped into the room, leaning against the counter as he watched me. You don't have to do all that, he said, his voice low. I don't mind, I replied, not looking at him. There was a pause, the kind that made the air between us feel heavy. Elise, he said softly, and the way he said my name made me stop. I turned to him, my heart pounding. What? He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. You don't always have to do it alone. I didn't know what to say. The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at me, it was too much. I turned back to the sink, my hands trembling as I picked up a plate, but his words stayed with me, long after he'd left the room. I couldn't stop thinking about what Ethan had said the night before. You don't always have to do it alone. The words had settled into my chest like a weight, impossible to ignore. I'd spent so many years convincing myself that I was fine, that I didn't need anyone. But now, with Ethan here, that lie felt harder to maintain. He was in the house more than usual that week, working on small projects he'd taken upon himself. Fixing a broken cabinet door, organizing the tools in the garage. His presence was steady, grounding, and yet it left me feeling unmoored. One night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house fell into its usual stillness, I found myself wandering into the living room. Ethan was there, sprawled across the couch, his long legs stretched out and a book resting on his chest. The soft glow of the lamp cast shadows across his face, and for a moment I just stood there, watching him. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice low and quiet. I shook my head, stepping further into the room. Not really. He sat up, placing the book on the coffee table. Want to sit? I hesitated for only a moment before sinking into the armchair across from him. The silence between us was heavy, the kind that felt like it was waiting for someone to break it. I was thinking about James today, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. What about him? Just how he used to fill this house. It feels so quiet without him. Ethan's gaze was steady, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "It doesn't feel quiet to me," he said softly. I looked at him, my breath catching in my throat. There was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at me, that made the air between us feel charged. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. When he stood, crossing the room to kneel in front of my chair, my heart leapt into my throat. His hand reached for mine, his touch warm and steady. "Elise," he said, my name a quiet plea on his lips. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me like he was trying to memorize my face, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. "Tell me I'm not imagining this," he said, his voice raw. I couldn't say it because it wasn't true. I wasn't imagining it, and neither was he. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Neither do I," he said, "but I can't stop thinking about you, about us." The words sent a shiver through me, and before I could stop myself, my free hand reached up to touch his face. His eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and when they opened again, they were filled with so much longing it made my chest ache. "Ethan, we can't," I started, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. "Why not?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Because it was wrong. Because it was complicated. Because it could ruin everything." But none of those reasons felt strong enough to make me pull away. The next day, I did everything I could to avoid him. I threw myself into chores, cleaning rooms that didn't need cleaning, and reorganizing the pantry for the third time that month. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, the way he'd looked at me, like I was the only thing that mattered. By mid-afternoon, the tension was unbearable. I found myself in the study, rearranging books on the shelves in a desperate attempt to keep my hands busy. "Do you need help with that?" Ethan's voice came from the doorway, and I jumped, the book in my hands slipping to the floor. "No," I said quickly, bending to pick it up. "I've got it." He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that made it hard to breathe. "Elise, we need to talk." "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, turning back to the shelves. "Why not?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "Because," I trailed off, my hands trembling as I placed the book on the shelf. "Because you're scared," he said, stepping closer. I turned to face him, my back against the bookshelf. "Of course I'm scared," I said, my voice rising. This isn't supposed to happen." "But it did," he said, his voice calm, "and pretending it didn't won't make it go away." I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He stepped closer, his hands bracing against the shelf on either side of me, trapping me in place. "Elise," he said softly, his voice a whisper against my skin. "Just tell me you don't feel the same, and I'll walk away." I couldn't say it because it wasn't true. Instead, I reached up, my hand trembling as it rested against his chest. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't have to do anything," he said, leaning in until our foreheads touched. "Just let me in." And I did. That evening the storm returned, rain pounding against the windows as thunder rolled in the distance. We sat on the couch together, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. I looked at him, my chest tightening. "No," I said honestly. He nodded, his expression softening. "Neither do I." The tension between us was still there, but it felt different now. Less like a burden, and more like a promise. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. And when he leaned in, pressing his lips to mine, I didn't stop him. The house was quiet that night, the storm outside subsiding into a steady drizzle. I sat in the living room, a book in my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in over an hour. My mind was elsewhere. On him, on the moments we'd shared, on the way his gaze made me feel like I was coming undone. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Ethan walked into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that was impossible to ignore. He was barefoot, his shirt slightly wrinkled, and there was a quiet intensity in his expression that made my heart race. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, setting the book aside. "No, you?" he shrugged, leaning against the doorway. "Not really." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged, thick with everything we hadn't said. "Ethan," I began, but he interrupted me. "Can I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the spot beside me on the couch. I hesitated, my chest tightening, but I nodded. He sat down, leaving just enough space between us to make the silence feel unbearable. I could feel the heat of him, the way his presence seemed to draw me in like gravity. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I turned to him, my breath catching in my throat. "About what?" "You know what," he said, his gaze meeting mine. I looked away, my hands twisting in my lap. "I don't know if I can." "Yes, you can," he said gently, reaching out to take my hand in his. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. "Just tell me how you feel." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "It's complicated," I said finally. "I don't care," he replied, his voice soft but resolute. I looked up at him, my eyes burning with unshed tears. "It's not that simple, Ethan. It's wrong." "Why?" he asked, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. "Because other people might not understand? Because it scares you?" "Because it scares me too, Elise. But I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting you." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I felt my walls cracking, the carefully constructed defenses I'd built over years of loneliness beginning to crumble. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. "Just tell me to stop," he murmured. "If you don't feel the same, just say the word, and I'll leave you alone. But if you do..." I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell him to stop because I didn't want him to. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing against his in a tentative kiss. It was soft, hesitant, but the second his hand came up to cup my cheek, it deepened. Years of longing, of loneliness, of denying myself the chance to feel alive again, all of it poured into that kiss. His hands were gentle but insistent, his touch igniting something in me I thought had died a long time ago. We didn't make it upstairs right away. The living room became a blur of soft whispers and quiet gasps, our movements slow and deliberate as we explored the boundaries we'd both been too afraid to cross. By the time we made it to my bedroom, the rain outside had picked up again, the sound of it tapping against the windows as lightning flashed in the distance. Ethan paused at the doorway, his gaze searching mine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I said, the word leaving my lips without hesitation. The next moments unfolded with a tenderness that took my breath away. Ethan's touch was reverent, his movements deliberate, as if he was afraid I might vanish if he wasn't careful. I let myself surrender to him, to the way he made me feel seen and wanted in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a connection that felt impossibly deep, like we were both finding something we hadn't even realized we'd lost. When it was over, we lay tangled together beneath the sheets, the room bathed in the soft glow of the storm outside. Ethan's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "Yes," I said softly. He pressed a kiss to my forehead, pulling me closer. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I don't care how complicated it is, I just want to be with you." Tears stung my eyes, and I buried my face against his chest. "I don't know what happens next," I admitted, my voice trembling. "We'll figure it out," he said, his tone steady, "one step at a time." I woke before the sun, the house still shrouded in the soft gray light of dawn. For a moment, I stayed still, listening to the rhythmic sound of Ethan's breathing beside me. His arm was draped over my waist, his warmth a steady presence against the cool morning air. The events of the night before felt like a dream, fragile and surreal, but the weight of his hand on my hip and the way his chest rose and fell told me it was real. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: relief, guilt, fear, and something dangerously close to joy. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake him. Pulling on my robe, I padded to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet. The house felt different this morning, quieter in a way that wasn't unsettling, but peaceful. I brewed a pot of coffee, the scent filling the air as I leaned against the counter, staring out the window. The garden glistened with dew, the daisies Ethan had teased me about still standing tall in the early light. Last night, I had let my guard down completely, and now I wasn't sure how to put it back up. Everything felt so precarious, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't fully see. "Morning." His voice startled me, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway. His hair was tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled, and there was a softness in his eyes that made my chest ache. Good morning, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He walked over to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee before leaning against the opposite side of the kitchen island. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us filled with everything we hadn't said. Are you okay? He asked finally, his tone careful. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth. Are you? He smiled faintly, setting his mug down. I am if you are. The simplicity of his words made my throat tighten, and I looked down at the counter, my fingers tracing the edge of the mug in my hands. I don't know what happens now, I admitted. Neither do I, he said, his voice steady. But I don't regret it, Elise. Not for a second. I looked up at him, his words sinking into my chest like a balm. I don't regret it either, I said softly. The relief in his expression was palpable, and he stepped around the island, closing the distance between us. His hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine as he squeezed gently. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice calm and sure. I nodded, holding onto his hand like it was the only thing keeping me steady. Later that morning, I sat on the porch with my second cup of coffee, the sunlight warming my skin as I watched Ethan in the garden. He was pulling weeds, his movements deliberate as he worked to tame the wild overgrowth. The sight of him there, so natural and at ease, brought a small smile to my lips. The guilt wasn't gone. It lingered at the edges of my mind, a quiet reminder of the line we'd crossed. But alongside it was something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The path ahead of us was uncertain, filled with questions I didn't have the answers to. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid to face it. As I sat there, the sound of birds in the distance and the gentle hum of the world waking up, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to feel alive again.